I think one has to first see, relative to what we have today, is it an improvement or not? And I think it's a huge improvement on what we have today. Remember that people forget that huge simplification and uniformity is going to be achieved relative to what we had. Simple. Today, if you take a product, you have an excise on it, and you probably have, God knows how many rates the different states are charging different rates. Yes. So all of that now, we have one product, one rate all over India, right? The question you ask about complexity is that, could we have gone down to fewer rates? And in that sense, we can talk about it going forward. But relative today, there's been a huge improvement in complexity, much greater uniformity. And then when you add in the fact that you're going to have a common IT system where you're going to get all these compliance benefits from this, I think, so relative to today, I think it's a huge improvement. Of course, relative to what all of us would like to see, there are some shortcomings which I think need to be addressed over time.
I'm at least, I'm glad you're at least being candid that there are shortcomings that will be addressed along the way. There is no denying the fact this is a giant leap. I'm not one of those detractors who believe that this is just about an improvement being made. But do you believe this is still very messy? This is still complex. I mean, we still have, 6 to 7 rate structures. Even you hadn't recommended that. What would you attribute this to? Political compromises?
Yeah, I think that I would attribute it to two things actually, right? One is that, think about it, 29 plus 2 plus 1, there are at least 32 actors in this,
right, yes,
representing 32 divergent interests, right? Now, so to accommodate all of that, does require some compromises, and I think that that's part of the reason. The other part of the reason which I want to emphasize, which people don't realize, is that some of it is inherited. Remember that we didn't start these negotiations afresh in 2014 or whatever.
You built on a consensus that was built, yes.
Especially in relation to the base, which is the next big area where things could be improved. We inherited a lot of these things, alcohol being out, petroleum being out, land and real estate being out. These were all inherited things. And I do think that, some of these things, had we had, maybe, a different context, we could have worked through these things. And I think we can certainly work through these things going forward. But I think, a very important point to make in terms of what the achievement is. We have shown that you can get cooperative federalism in India working in a way that we never thought was conceivable. Remember that this is not just accommodating.
This is states giving up their fiscal autonomy, which one had not thought they would.
And bipartisan, across the political spectrum, we've got buy-in from everyone. So I think, and very important that in the GST Council, we've established a process for consensus-based democratic deliberative decision making.
That's right.
Which is going to be the basis for improving the system going forward.
Fair point indeed. When you talk about cooperative federalism, I still want to ask you the question. When you say a lot of the compromises were on the basis of what you inherited, it wasn't a fresh start. You didn't start talking afresh to states. There was a body of work that was done by finance ministers or prime ministers in the past. I'm going to ask you a very point-blank political question. Who gets the credit for the GST that's rolled out?
I mean, it's in the nature of this that credit should go to many people over a long period of time across the political spectrum and across the country. I mean, many people get credit for it because it's not, it's been around.
So when you say many people, it's people outside of this government as well.
I mean, we've been at this for a while. But I think at the end of the day, you also have to recognize that this long, protracted process came to fruition under this government, and I think so. So that's something you have to. And finally, I think one thing which this is a point that you and I will completely not disagree on, is that we have to also give credit to, I think, the unsung, unseen heroes of this.
Sure enough, yes.
The staff of the tax departments of the center, the states, GSTN, over many periods of time. So credit here in this cannot be appropriated by any one person, party, state, individual.
But he who runs the last lap breasts the finishing tape, and I think this is where the credit lies as far as this
absolutely. I mean, and you have to recognize
that. When you talk about compromises, I'm going to ask you to wear your economist hat and answer this question for me. As an economist, your big concern and your big obsession will be how will it attribute to growth. There were various rounds, 1%, 2 percentage point. It's come down to 9/10 of a percentage point, 4/10 of a percentage point. While I will ask you to still give me a number, but because this is a compromised GST, have we also compromised its economic benefit in that sense?
Look, I think that the cleaner, the simpler, the lower the rates, the larger the base, obviously the greater the benefit. So it's kind of correlated, right? So, but I will still say that the growth impact will be substantial even with this, but it can become even bigger once we address all the things that you and I have identified.
Would you quantify substantial for me? Put a number on
that.
No,
I see. The thing is that to be honest, since I have not done any of this work, and what I've seen, I don't want to assess that. I would say just think of it in qualitative terms as very substantial, reasonable, with potential for upside gains over time.
The other part of the GST debate that people both in North Block and Mint Street are concerned about is the short-term inflationary impact of the GST, because it's the input tax credit that will offset costs, and and going forward we will perhaps see long-term it's going to be anti-inflationary, but to begin with it may perhaps be inflationary. Is that a concern that you share, and what's the plan to tackle it if it were to happen?
So on this, let me say two things, very important that everyone must recognize. One, the analysis that's been done within, and I think several other people maybe have done this, that if you look at the actual choice of rates, the incidence is on average below what it is today. So the incidence is coming down, therefore prices should have a downward bias, not an upward bias.
Even over the short term?
Even over the short term. And the second point comes to the short term. The second point, and this is a kind of odd thing to say, but remember that the disposal of stocks that's taking place to prepare, that is also having an impact on bringing down prices in the short run. I mean, it may not be for the best reasons or whatever. So in the short run, you're also getting this stock disposal, which is reducing prices, and the incidence is coming down. So I expect prices to, in the short run as well, to be on the downward side, not on the upward side. Of course, there will be, the problem will be, there's a perception issue. You see, there are two perception problems going forward. One, always there will be more noise about where they've gone up than
where they've come down.
Praise where they've come down.
Yes.
One. Second, it's a very, very important point to tell everyone. When consumers look at their tax bill, today they only see the state VAT. But in it is embedded the excise tax as well.
Yes,
but going forward, they will see both. So perceptionally, there may be this misperception that, oh my God, huge increase. So these are two perceptual things which are unavoidable, but we have to work hard to correct them.
So you're actually giving me the contrarian view, because we interviewed Mr. Adya and he believes that the government needs to watch out against the short-term impact. I get your argument. So in that sense, you don't believe this is going to have any impact on monetary policy. If at all, you believe it's going to have a positive impact.
Absolutely. I think there is, the incidence is a downward bias, the stock disposal also downward bias. But some prices may go up, but on average, it should be in the downward direction.
So GST should create more elbow room for monetary easing.
Yeah, I've always said that, but remember, it's an important point to make. Whether it's the house rent allowance, which will have an upward thing, or the GST, which I think will have downward. Remember, monetary policy has to see through what are temporary things, both on the upside and on the downside. These per se should not have any impact on monetary policy, but equally the fact is that the GST will have a downward impact on prices.
One of the things that I think both Mint Street and a lot of global brokerages are looking at is how does GST, if at all I can use the word, distort the fiscal space of this government? Because back of the envelope calculations are that the revenue loss could amount to about 2 lakh crore rupees. Is there a fiscal implosion that one is looking at?
Okay, but now first let me stop you here, right? in the same,
an alarmist.
No, in the same, no, I won't, I can make two accusations against you. Alarmism or inconsistency.
Okay.
I'm going to leave aside alarmism and I'm going to throw the inconsistency.
It's my job to ask you questions on inflation.
No. So you can't both say that, oh my God, 2 lakh crore loss and say prices will go up. The one is related to the other.
I understand.
So my own view is that downward bias to prices, okay, some impact on revenues, but how much we can claw back through greater compliance and through formalization remains to be seen, and I think there will be some clawback. At the end of the day, there may be some, some shortfall as a result of this, which we'll have to wait and see. But that shortfall, if anything, is a consequence or will be a consequence of prices coming down and incidents coming down.
So you don't believe this is going to be so alarming that it's going to distort the fiscal space?
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that was never a part of your report, but we see it finally, is the anti-profiteering clause that has been introduced. I was interviewing the former Finance Minister Chidambaram, and he said this is not just draconian, it defies market economics. Let me just voice his opinion.
Yeah,
before
sure.
Why don't you leave this to market forces? Why should competition not be left to market forces to determine?
Okay.
Why should the government step in?
The thing is that, first of all, I think it has to be emphasized, and it's something that happened late in the day, but which needs to be, is that this is sunsetted. 2 years, that's it. There's no anti-profiteering after that. So all the concerns, whatever you may have, is about the short run. Now, why was it necessary? I think it's necessary in a democratic system where people think, politicians think that they have to reassure the public that prices will not go up. So it's more like a credibility signaling device than a device that we hope to be actually using, let alone overusing at all. So that's the way. Sunsetted first. Minimal use going forward. Certainly the small traders and all exempted from it, and whatever it is will be.
So you believe the fears are unfounded for? I mean, there is a lot of fear on the street.
Yeah.
I'm just asking you, is that fear unfounded for?
I mean, the intention certainly is not to overuse it or use it at all. But we have to see how it goes. But I mean, in any case, it's after 2 years, it's out.
If it's sunsetted for 2 years, and if you see the incidence of this not happening, because competition will take care of prices,
exactly.
That's market economics.
Exactly.
Are you willing to repeal it earlier?
I see. That's a great question. If within 6 months we find that prices are generally downward, the GST Council can and should say we don't need it.
Fair point indeed. I'll ask a quick question on farmers, because you mentioned the politicians here. The opposition, which boycotted the whole mega launch, is accusing the government of being anti-farmer. They believe that the tax advances on fertilizers have gone up from 6 to 12%. Contract farming is under the 18% bracket. How are you going to defend your government's position on this?
Well, I think that we should separate out the GST from what's happening, in the rest of the economy, because after all, state governments are doing loan waivers, interest is being extended at subsidized rates and so on. So I think the two should be kept separately. I think there are challenges in agriculture which will be addressed, in other ways, procurement, minimum support prices, other ways of dealing with agriculture, and this is separate. So, for example, I don't think there will be any big increases in most of the input prices. I think they should be relatively small, because the aim of the government is, at this stage, when agriculture is under some stress, not to increase the stress on farmers.
I'll ask you two last questions, and one of them has to do with the protests that one did see in the run-up to the GST. Because many people believe that the small vendors or the small traders are really not ready to embrace, or were not really ready to embrace. I'm asking you, and both you and I agree that the GST will be disruptive. It is a massive tax reform. By when do you see the pain ebb away? By when do you see the teething problems wane on disruption?
I mean, I think we should, all of us should, give it about 3 to 6 months for both the compliance side, the small traders, the technology platform to settle down. And I think at the end of 6 to 9, certainly by the end of this year, fiscal year, hopefully before, should settle down. So 3 to 6 months, I think, of, teething challenges, which by the way, we would have had even if we had postponed it by 1 or 2 or 3 months. It's in the nature of this business.
Absolutely.
As you said, I think if it were not so disruptive, it wouldn't be a mega reform.
And I, unlike a lot of people out there, I believe you can never be completely prepared to embrace something like this. I completely agree with you. A last question, and this has to do with your experience here in the government. You've now dealt with enough politicians on the GST. I'm going to ask you a very frank question. Do you believe real estate, electricity and petroleum can be included in the GST anytime soon? We've taken so long to get where we have, but without its inclusion, we're still far away from what would perhaps be closer to a perfect GST.
No, see, I actually think land and real estate and power, certainly land and real estate are, not elusive at all for the GST Council. Even in the last few months, this was raised by a number of states as something that needs to be done, and the finance minister himself said that that this is something that we need to bring in at the earliest opportunity. So I'm hoping, and I have confidence that the GST Council, especially, remember, in all of these things, nothing succeeds like success.
Absolutely.
Yeah. If you can show that this is working well, then I think the incentives to bring it in, especially if, and given that the government and the Prime Minister are keen on this anti-black money agenda, I mean, there's no better, less intrusive way of achieving that than bringing land and real estate.
But you're largely alluding to land and real estate. What about electricity and petroleum?
See, petroleum, latest within 5 years had come in. Power, I think, should also come in soon. I think that in the case of power, I think we just need to reassure the states that they will not lose too much fiscal autonomy, and there are ways of bringing in power and petroleum. Just to give an example, the way we should do it is, for example, to say there will be some, whatever, 6-12% on these, and the rest states can still retain autonomy on that. That way, these products come into the system, the input tax credit flows, the compliance benefit flow as well.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/ETNow.